Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, an introduction to Venetian women, as part of the ongoing series of Venetian episodes. When I originally designed the Venetian episodes, I was going to write a cumulative story, like 30 Objects of Desire or the Rosa stories, which can be found on the blog that accompanies this podcast. As such, there was a twist at the end, and I'd been keeping the twist to myself. Since this is now going to become a supplement, somewhat like the Cornish supplement, there's no point in keeping the twist to myself, and it's this. The city of Venice has, behind each corner and under the water of the lagoon, a parallel mirror city called Serenissima, and Serenissima is ruled by a doge, but the doge is ruled by a fairy mentioned only once in the Ars Magica literature. It's called the Player of Games, the Magister Ludi. I put together the Magister Ludi because I wanted something at the upper end of the might frame that is given for the design of characters, in the same way that the Great Drake of the Pyrenees is as big as dragons get, and St. Mary is as powerful as saints get, and the Dukes of Hell that are able to walk the earth are 75 might, and they're as high as that goes. I wanted something at the upper limit, and originally it was Hermes, but I found that Hermes who steals away can be simulated with a far less powerful creature. So I created this other thing, and I only mentioned him once because I didn't get the chance to completely unfold his backstory. And it's this. He claims to be what's left of the founder Titalis. He went into the fairy lands, was distorted by them, and now he is using the city as an engine to build a new embodiment for a queen, a fairy. A powerful piece that allows whatever is in deep Arcadia to make itself known and felt in the mortal world. Fairies are dependent on humans because they are dependent on our stories, but with a powerful piece like the Queen, this thing that claims to be Titalis can force an early renaissance. And because of this, you get anachronistic things in Serenissima, and also you get fairies forcing humans to tell new and original stories. That is, the fairies are changing the way we tell stories about ourselves. The fairies are becoming more powerful because they are rewriting us. Now, my way of collecting together material for this is by working through, for LibriVox, a biography of the history of the Dogeresses of Venice. And I've already mentioned one of them in the story of the Rotting Princess. I was being a little bit careful and secretive there because I'm used to holding the twist until the last episode. The husband of the Rotting Princess offered to whatever powers could save his wife, whatever they wanted. And in the same way that in second edition Ars Magica, there was concern that a Fairy Queen of Winter was going to make a treaty with the Normans so that she could rampage across England and Normandy whenever she wanted. England and Aquitaine whenever she wanted, and help the English take Normandy. So, by making this treaty, the Doge has allowed the Player of Games to inhabit his city. That is, his fairy aura is coterminous with the city's borders. And this is why Venice is a city of strange sights and weird delights and passions. It's because all of that is being distilled into the Princess of Glass, who is gradually becoming more and more real in the heart of the city. So to veer away from that, I'm going to now give you a little bit of information about Venetian women that appears in the preface of the biographies of the Dogeresses. The writer over-admires the women of Venice. He seems cringy and excessive and slightly smarmy. I do apologise for that tone. As we go through, we're going to look at how we can turn the items that the women regularly use into story hooks. So the reader is a slightly younger version of myself, which means that we're going to have that problem where we'll be listening to me and then I'll cut in on me. And so now over to younger Timothy for Venice, the City of Women. The women of Venice were always distinguished for their natural quickness and intelligence, their sprightliness and vivacity of manner, their talkativeness and coaxing ways, and their fondness of music, song, and dance. Perhaps the most characteristic talent, however, was their devotion to the toilet, their love of beauty and of clothes. The Timothy from the future coming in after that guitar pluck. The book that I'm reading from is from the 19th century. Rather than saying toilet, we now, for some reason, use the French toilette. In person, they were usually somewhat short of stature, but endowed with grace of carriage. Their figures, especially their bosoms, were full, even to the degree of stoutness. This was in a great measure due to the softness of the Venetian climate, which induced a natural and becoming indolence. Nevertheless, they were vigorous in action and quite able to give a good account of themselves in marital and other squabbles. Their features were clearly cut and yet not too severe, their heads well-shaped and born, their eyes blue like their skies, or grey like their seas, and their hands and feet were small. Their most attractive attributes were the fair satin peach-like delicacy of their skin, and the brilliant lustre and golden sheen of their abundant light auburn hair. The slightly voyeuristic tone of that aside, it allows us to describe characters from Venice who are of the old families. They, generally speaking, are of such and such a height, have eyes of such and such a colour. The treatment of the skin was a speciality of the Venetian women. The use of the bath was one of their inheritances. They bathed the whole body frequently, sometimes in the sea at the Lido, but every house had its bath, in humble homes of wood or common metal, in patrician palaces of porcelain, glass, or silver. With the water they mixed simple or exotic perfumes. One of their secrets was to remain, with the whole body immersed and motionless, for at least half an hour, and another was they never rubbed the skin, but just dabbed at it and let it dry naturally. Then the nostrums of the masseuse's art were exploited. A not uncommon custom was to lay a slice of raw veal, dipped in new milk, upon the face at night. When I was a boy, my family owned a butchery, and the same trick, placing steak upon the face, was used for black eyes caused in pub fights. But moving along, this is how people who live in the middle of a marsh don't suffer the negative aging modifiers. They bathe a lot, and they have a sort of folk alchemy that they use to treat their illnesses. For richer women, other artifices followed suit: puffs and powders to gently temper the epidermis, or hide unsightly blotches, and pigments, rouge and others, which art might most effectively colour crude or enervated nature. Every woman and girl in Venice at all times painted, even the poorest of them. The cult is still practised at Chioggia, where you never see a woman without artificial colour. There, by the way, may still be seen the true Venetian type of female beauty, and the old Venetian trait of sitting leisurely under shade or shelter, while some sympathetic voice reads Aristo or some other favourite poet. I'm going to have to track him down to see whether there's anything that can be tied into Serenissima there. One very delightful attribute of Venetian women was their fragrance. Their skins and hair were always perfumed. Whenever a gentle donna passed, she left behind her a delicious aroma. If she paused, the air around her became saturated with the sweetest odours. This seductive charm is still characteristic of the real Venetian. Her love of scent is hereditary and delightful. We'll come back to this in a later episode, but selling perfume is one way that magi can make money for their covenant without trading. The other thing is that going to a perfume shop and sitting around and sampling different perfumes and having a chat with your friends is a very common way for patrician women to spend their time, which allows magicians who run such places to develop a web of contacts and to hear intriguing stories. This habit comes from the dogeressa who became the rotting princess. That is, she introduced this style of socializing. In a very real sort of way, the Venetian gentle donna was a living embodiment of Venus. As a reminder, Venus is a liminal creature. People think that she should be a fairy because she's a god, but she was born from the foam that rose up when Zeus cut off his father's genitals and threw them into the sea. So she's technically a Titaness. She's a member of the magical realm. The fairest and sweetest of all the goddesses. Hence Venice has been quite aptly called the city of Venus, the city of fair women. There was one special favourite among all the delicious perfumes which dispensed their sweet aroma all over Venice, and Count Lorenzo Magalotti, in his Fioro d'Arancino, tells us how it was made. Take, he says, the empty skin of an orange with a little powdered benzoin, with 2 pounded cloves and a small stick of cinnamon, cover them with the finest rose water, and set to boil upon a brazier. In the 16th century, the far-famed Portuguese Buccheri got to Venice, little charms of sweet-smelling clay, and they very soon became every woman's treasures. The odour dispensed when a Bucchero was dipped in hot water was very refreshing and resembled the aroma which arises from parched ground on a hot summer's day after a copious shower of rain. Modern internet-y people call this scent petrichor. I like the idea of these little balls of clay as magic items for illusionists, so I'm tempted to sneak them in, along with many of the other wonderful Venetian things that we can't have in 1220. That's one of the reasons why the presence of the player of games pushes excess a little further, a little faster, and so the material culture of Venice evolves towards what we expect a couple of 100 years later in mythic Europe. When dipped in essences, they gave forth for ever so long the sweetest of perfumes. Women wore them in their bosoms and were accustomed to place them often upon their lips, so that their kisses might be scented too. And now we may see where the one kiss-ranged spell we have in Ars Magica comes from, Kiss of Death. Why would you do it that way? Because you're in Venice, and that's what people do instead of touch for certain spells. The other kiss-ranged effect I can think of is Kiss of the Mermaid from the Fairies book, which is also perfectly fine for people living in a city where the streets are made out of water. Not only were the girls and women of Venice, the city of saints, much drawn to the general claims and duties of religion, but in particular they were exponents of some of its minor behests. The Apostle speaks of the hair of women and says it was given to them to be a protection unto glory. The Venetians exactly carried out the apostolic injunction. From the very first foundation of the Riva Alto, away in the 5th century, the women of the lagoons were accustomed to resort daily to the altaine or flat roofs of their dwellings, and there spend much time in combing and dressing their hair in the sunshine. So an altaine, that is a rooftop, could be a ritually prepared boundary space. Since women are meant to be spending a lot of time up there anyway, and no one pays much attention, why not do what the Arbitan Magi do and create a ritual space with enormous props that boost your power? This habit they undoubtedly inherited from their Greek ancestresses. Homer sings about the beautiful fair hair of the Greeks, and he has painted the captivating Helen of Troy with abundant locks of gold. The general colour of Grecian women's hair was brown, light and dark, and such naturally was the hue of Venetian women's tresses. The poets, however, made a dead set against that tint, and stated their case so broadly that brown hair was regarded with aversion as appertaining to traitors, murderers, and other evildoers. Fairies, being creatures of story, will hold to this cultural value, that is, murderous fairies will have brown hair. In Venice, much in the same way that werewolf fairies have red hair in Slavic areas. The painters took up their cue, and we rarely see, in the pictures of Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, Tintoretto, or Veronese, women with brown hair. Auburn, or as they called it, golden hair, was the most popular, most beautiful, and most expressive. The more it glittered, the better was it liked, and what nature marred, art embellished. A primitive, but withal most effective device in the Venetian artifices of the toilet was the superimposition upon the top of the head, the hair being well combed out and rippling over the shoulders, of a crownless, wide-brimmed straw hat called solana, sun frame. As a reminder, the shape and material table suggests a +4 bonus for enchantments that affect the image of the wearer of a hat. The brim shielded the neck and bosom, whilst the sunlight, not the heat, got at the roots of the hair and blanched its growth. Every altana had its group of animated mushrooms, each woman and girl sitting thus, and ever and anon damping the exposed hair and cuticle with a small sponge, stuck at the end of a spinning spindle or some such sceptre, and dipped in cunning tinctures. There's a lot of space for folk magic and domestic magic here, or even high alchemy. Beneath the brim of the solana, big long-toothed combs of yellow tortoiseshell were used to keep the hair supple. The shape and material bonus table gives the following: combs, hair 7, beauty 5. Tortoiseshell does not appear on the table. I did write something about it a while ago. The ancient Romans believed that tortoiseshell was a paradox because it was a fundamentally unclean substance that had been made beautiful enough that you could put it into insets in tables. But no, I don't think it's ever been statted up. I'll need to think that one through. Or freezing irons or bones to make it curl or wave. This method was admirably effective and is still adopted privately by many a beautiful Venetian girl and buxom dame. With respect to the recipes employed in the concoction of the tinctures, little can be authoritatively said, for each fair one kept her elixir and its secret to herself. Anyhow, generally speaking, one may say that the finest of fine Lido golden sand, crushed vitreous plaques of Murano, ivory sawdust, pounded seashells, and in exuberant and extravagant humour even powdered pearls and precious gold dust were employed. The powdered Murano mentioned before is glass. Murano is the island where the best glass is made at one point in Venice's history. Vegetable compounds, the juice of grapes, berberries, ivy berries, lemon squash, and orange flavour, with aromatic powders of all sorts and kinds, were also used, Dyes, strictly so called, were not in favour. Their effect was ephemeral. Magi can generate many of these substances, or alternatively, they can be leftovers from lab experiments. Where else are you going to get ivory sawdust, for example? They mention lemon squash here. Lemon juice is still used in my part of Australia for this blonding ritual, or so I'm led to believe. Venetian women and girls owed a great deal to Dogaressa Teodora Selvo in the 11th century, for she introduced toilet batteries fully furnished with all the requisites for skin, hair, and teeth, together with delicious Eastern perfumes. And that's her, that's literally the rotting princess. Giovanni Maranello of Modena in the 16th century gathered up all that was known of the artifices of the coiffure in his classical work, Gli Ornamenti del Don. Venetians were past mistresses in the mysteries of hairdressing. The Greek style was always the most in favour, where the hair, not being too dry nor too tightly plaited, was drawn off the face and neck, tied in a ribbon at the back, and then coiled round and round the head and stuck fast with combs and pins. The hard line of the forehead was tempered by a small row of curls under a semi-diadem fillet or crescent, called a gabbia, literally a cage, and usually made of precious metal and jewelled. I had thought that diadems were in the shape and material bonus table, but I can't see them. I can see crowns, and crowns are wisdom 2, control people 3, gain respect or exercise authority 5. Does this gabbia count as a crown, or would we prefer something else? I'm sure diadems have been started up because Calbaeus had diadems rather than true crowns, didn't it? We'll have to check that. This style Titian painted in the well-known portrait of his daughter Lavinia, presenting a golden dish of ripe fruit. Another fashion affected by gay and opulent courtesans was called al corno, with reference to the conventional headdress of the Dogaressas. Sometimes only one horn was projected, at other 2 or even 3 or more. An invisible bandeau was hidden under the hair, bearing spikes of tortoiseshell or whalebone, up which single strands of hair were twisted and curled until they assumed the appearance of vine spirals and tendrils. This vogue lasted quite a long time, certainly from 1540 to 1630. It was a very difficult feat to arrange these horns becomingly so as to avoid any idea of the ridiculous, the animal, or the demoniacal. Crescenti, they were euphemistically called, as suggestive of the crescent moon of Diana, the huntress of the gods. Sometimes historical material just hands you a cultic headdress, like now. Why is the Dogaressa of Venice, who has her own patron saint, wandering around with the headdress of the cult of Diana? The obvious thing to do would be to place her at the centre of something like the Court of the Golden Bough, which is covered in one of the early Ars Magica books. It's the thing that Fraser got very excited about a sacrificial king. The implementation eludes me for the moment, but it's important to mark that that's there. The painters never admired this style of hairdressing, and very few, if any of them, have depicted the al corno. Giacomo Franco and other engravers, however, have preserved for us illustrations of this peculiar mode. A third manner of hairdressing was popular amongst quite young girls and aged women, the 2 extremes, the cap of Juliet. The hair was combed out and smoothed down, and then tight-fitting jaunty caps or nets were fitted close over the head behind the ears, leaving the long locks of hair spread out like fans upon the neck behind or in small ringlets. These caps, usually very beautifully made, as often as not gold or silver thread, or net, or wire, and gemmed. The shape and material bonuses don't help us much here. Juliet caps are presumably just another type of hat, so they have the same bonuses as the Solana mentioned before. Hair nets are technically nets, which means that they have immobilized 5 and then whatever material they're made out of. I'd like to suggest, however, that they instead have the same bonus as helmets, at least one of the bonuses, and that they affect the mind of the wearer with a bonus of 4. Beyond that, of course, they're jewellery, and jewellery is protection of various scores, so maybe protection 3. A favourite style was a delicate net of silk, or very small artificial flowers of blue, as contrasting most serenely with the golden glitter of the hair. Perhaps I have an older version of the shape and material collection, because I'd swear that silk had been written up somewhere. House Tremare Magi wear a special sort of silk as their fundamental garment. It's their uniform. It's made by ethereal fishermen spiders, which are grown in the depths of their covenants. Fashionables always carried fans, not those with which we are familiar, but little flags set on stems or poles. Ventolini, wind guards they were called, strong sea breezes, not strong sunbeams, were to be warded off, for they disturbed the hair and roughened the skin. Venetian beauties never, as we say, fanned themselves. They had no need to do so, because the sea air always tempered the sun's heat. So I love these. Back in Sanctuary of the Ice, I suggested that female magicians should carry a spindle rather than a wand. It performs much the same function, and when someone sees you carrying one, they think, well, it's a woman. She's carrying a spindle. Women carry spindles everywhere. Now, these little flags, which we call fans just because we're used to fans from the English Empire when it went to China, these little wind guards are similarly things that women carry everywhere and could use instead of a wand. Listen into the description and you'll see that there are all sorts of ways you can customize yours to suit your magician. Different woods, different fabrics, different rattly little beads, different symbols on the front. They're perfect and they're lovely, and I'm so glad we found them. These fans were from 6 to 12 inches square and were made of cloth of gold, richly embroidered silk, Burano lace, or feathers. They were fringed with beads and shells, through which the wind whistled musically when shaken in the air. The stem, a foot or more long, was usually of tortoiseshell, carved cedar wood, or of gold and silver, and jewelled for state occasions. In 1522, the Provvedentori del Pomp published a decree of the council regulating extravagant decoration of the Ventolini. Venetians never used parasols or sunshades. They wore their dress sleeves short in order to expose the arm with its jewelled bracelets above the elbow, obvious magic items, and their bare or lace-covered breasts to the soft sea air of the lagoons and the not too ardent rays of the golden sun. So there we have an introduction to Venetian women, and particularly the magic items that your maga could wear surreptitiously as she strides about Venice. But maybe she doesn't want to be this fashionable. Your saga may vary.